actually get you the fact that just regular P by itself is true, especially if you're trying to show that P is true. That was your goal all along. So idempotence can actually help you out there. This wraps up our lectures on replacement rules. We are now done with replacement rules, and starting in the next lecture, we will be looking at rules of inference. So that means we'll finally start looking at how to prove things are true that we didn't already know were true. And here with the replacement rules, all we were doing is taking things that are true and rewriting them in different ways. So this is substantially different when we get into rules of inference, because we'll actually be able to deduce that things are true that we didn't know were true to start out with. And that's going to be really neat, and I hope to see you then when we start off with something called modus ponens. Join me then. Welcome back to Logic 101. I'm William Spaniel, and this lecture is the first lecture on our unit on rules of inference. We're kicking things off with something called modus ponens. But before we get to that, I first want to briefly talk about what we're doing in this unit in general. So what is a rule of inference? Well, what we're going to be doing throughout this unit is starting with two or more inputs. These inputs are true, and we sometimes might refer to these inputs as premises. And then using rules of inference, we are going to output a new statement that must be true as a consequence of the premises. So you have true inputs, you apply rules of inference, and you get a new output that is also true. And so this rule of inference is going to be giving us a conclusion that did not exist before. This is in stark contrast with replacement rules. In the previous unit, when we were looking at replacement rules, all those replacement rules were doing was rewriting things that were already true into other things that are identical in terms of truth, but just with a different window dressing. So in rules of replacement, we're not actually learning anything new. We're just learning how to say things differently. With the rules of inference, we're actually reaching conclusions that didn't exist before. So rules of inference actually tell us something new about the world that rules of replacement don't do. So to see this in example, let's get to modus ponens. Now, modus ponens is a Latin phrase. It's actually short for modus ponendo ponens, which is a mouthful, which is why we shorten it to modus ponens, but it's definitely cooler than what this actually translates to in English, which is the way that affirms by affirming. Yeah, that doesn't actually sound that exciting, but it's a little bit cooler once we actually apply it. So modus ponens works like this. You need two premises. One is P implies Q, and the other one is P. So you need an implication, and you need the antecedent of the implication to be true. And as always, just like with replacement rules, these sentences here could either be simple sentences or they could be compound expressions. Doesn't matter. As long as you have the implication being true and the antecedent being true, then you know that the consequent must be true as a consequence. And those three dots there represent therefore. So you say premise 1, P implies Q, premise 2, P, therefore Q. So why does this work? Well, think about some examples here. So first, if I am Miley Cyrus, I am crazy. I am Miley Cyrus. Suppose those two things are true. It's clear that number one is true, and suppose, in fact, I was Miley Cyrus. Well, if I was Miley Cyrus and Miley Cyrus is crazy, then I must be crazy as a result. And you'll notice here that this form, these sentences on the right, is identical to the logical form on the left. So all we're doing is saying, hey, if the antecedent is true, and it's true that the antecedent implies the consequent, then the consequent must be true if the antecedent is true. So if I'm Miley Cyrus and Miley Cyrus is crazy, I must be crazy. Second example, if Lucy holds the football, Charlie Brown will miss. Lucy holds the football. So those are premises, and based off of those premises, we can conclude that Charlie Brown will miss. Because Lucy's holding the football, and whenever Lucy holds the football, Charlie Brown misses, we get that. And then lastly, as our third example, this might be the most easy one, or the easiest one to follow, just because this works in a geometric way, which I'll be showing in a second. If I am in California, I am in America. I am in California. Well, I'm actually not in California right now. I'm in New York. But suppose I were in California. It's true that if I am in California, I am in America. And if I am in California, I must be in America as a result. That's because California is entirely within the United States. So if you're inside of California, then you must be inside of the United States as well. And we can actually see this as a proof by picture. So this is how modus ponens works just by picture form. You can think of P as being California here and Q as being the United States. And just like this is actually an image lifted from our lecture on contraposition, just like before in that lecture on contraposition, if you're in P, just like that black dot there, if you're in California, and because P is entirely within Q, because California is entirely within the United States, if you're in P, if you're in California, you must be in America. So that's the proof by picture version of modus ponens, but we can also verify modus ponens and see how modus ponens works using truth tables. So here we have P, Q, and P implies Q. P was a premise, P implies Q was a premise, and Q was our conclusion. I'm going to highlight where P and P implies Q are true, because remember, those are our premises, and we are knowing that they are true ahead of time because they're given to us as being true by virtue of the fact that they're premises. So notice that P is true in the top two rows. So true, true there. I've highlighted them there. And then on the right side, on the right column, P implies Q. That's true in 3 instances, the top row and the bottom 2 rows. And notice that the only place that P and P implies Q are true is in the top row. So if P is true and P implies Q is true, that means we must be in the top row. But if we must be in the top row, then we know something about Q. We know, namely, that Q must be true. And that's exactly what modus ponens tells us. It says that if P is true and P implies Q is true, if the implication is true and the antecedent is true, then the consequent must be true as well. And that's exactly what this truth table is recovering. So that's modus ponens for you. And in the next lecture, we'll see another similar rule of inference called modus tollens. Hope you enjoyed this, and I'll see you next time. Take care. Welcome back to Logic 101. I'm William Spaniel, and this lecture is on the rule of inference known as modus tollens. Modus tollens is a Latin phrase short for modus tollendo tollens, which translates roughly to the way that denies by denying. That, of course, is a mouthful, so you can see why logicians prefer calling this modus tollens instead. In any case, it works like this. You need 2 premises, P implies Q, and not Q, the negation of the consequent, where, as always, P and Q could be simple sentences or compound sentences, it doesn't matter. In any case, if you have these 2 premises, you can conclude not P as well. So P implies Q, not Q, therefore not P. And we can see how this works using the examples that we talked about last time with modus ponens. So for example, suppose you have the 2 premises, if I am Miley Cyrus, I am crazy. And instead of having the affirmation of the antecedent, we have the negation of the consequent. So for the second premise, we have I am not crazy. Well, if I'm Miley Cyrus, then I'm crazy. If I'm not crazy, then I can't possibly be Miley Cyrus. So those two premises, through modus tollens, allow us to conclude that I am not Miley Cyrus if I am not crazy. Similarly, if Lucy holds the football, Charlie Brown will miss. And if we know that Charlie Brown will not miss, then we can conclude that Lucy does not hold the football. Because if Lucy were to hold the football, that second premise can't be true. If Lucy holds the football, Charlie Brown misses, but in this case, Charlie Brown will not miss. So it can't be the case that Lucy is holding the football. And finally, if I am in California, I am in America, and I am not in America. Well, if I'm not in America, then I can't possibly be in California because being in California requires me to be in America. So as a result, we can conclude that I am not in California based off of those two premises and using modus tollens. And to prove this, we can look at just a picture. So this is the same picture as last time and also the picture that we looked at in contraposition, except I've moved that dot outside of the P and the Q sets. So you can think of this again as P being California and Q being the United States. If I'm outside of the United States and California is contained entirely within the United States, then by virtue of the fact that I'm not in the United States, I can't be in California. We can also prove this using a truth table, just like we did last time. So here I've filled out the entire truth table. We have the two simple sentences P and Q, and we're actually going to be focusing on the last three columns, which are not P, not Q, and P implies Q. So our two premises were P implies Q and not Q. So starting with not Q, let's highlight the two places, the two rows where not Q is true. That's in the second row and the fourth row. And then our other premise is P implies Q. That's true in 3 rows, the first row and the last 2 rows. And if you notice that if not Q and P implies Q are both true, that can only happen under one circumstance, which is in the bottom row. So we must be in the last row if we have not Q and P implies Q, but that means we can back out the fact then that not P is true. And that is exactly what modus tollens says. Modus tollens says if you have an implication and you have the negation of the consequent, you can conclude the negation of the antecedent. That's exactly what we see here. And lastly, we can also prove modus tollens using modus ponens. So this is a preview of the proofs that we're going to be looking at in the next unit. I don't want that to be jarring to you when we get to proofs, so I want to do some light introductions, and this is going to provide a nice opportunity to do that using modus ponens to prove modus tollens. So remember that we have two premises that allow us to use modus tollens, which are P implies Q and not Q. And we can actually use modus ponens here if we take the first premise, P implies Q, and we use contraposition. So the contrapositive of P implies Q is not Q implies not P. So we just take line 1 and we apply the contraposition to it, and we get not Q implies not P. That's a valid rule of replacement. And then now, if you notice line 2 and line 3, that's what allows us to use modus ponens. Modus ponens says that if we know that the antecedent is true, then we can conclude the consequent is true. So here the antecedent is line 2, that's not Q, and that is the antecedent of the implication in line 3. So if we take lines 2 and 3 and we apply modus ponens, then we get that the consequent is true, which is not P. And remember, that is exactly what modus tollens said. Modus tollens said that if you have lines 1 and 2 being true, that's P implies Q and not Q, that you get the negation of the antecedent, not P. And that is what we see here. So many different ways of proving modus tollens. We've done it 3 ways here, and we have also seen a neat way of introducing proofs, which is, again, what we're going to be getting to in the next unit. So I hope you enjoyed this lecture on modus tollens, and I will see you next time when we look at more rules of inference. Take care. Welcome back to Logic 101. I'm William Spaniel, and this lecture is on the rule of inference known as disjunctive syllogism. It actually has many other names. Some call it disjunctive elimination. Others simplify that name to just elimination by itself. Others make this way more complicated by using the Latin expression modus tollendo ponens. And if I've done the translation on my own properly, that means the way that affirms by denying. But we're sticking with the name disjunctive syllogism. For this to work, we need two premises. First, we need a disjunction, P or Q, hence the name disjunctive syllogism. Disjunction, disjunctive, got it? And as always, P and Q can either be simple sentences or compound expressions. Doesn't matter. And the second premise that we need is we need the negation of one of the two elements in the disjunction. So here that's not P. And if we have those two things, we can conclude that the other half of the disjunction is true, so Q. So to recap, disjunctive syllogism tells us if we have P or Q and not P, then therefore Q. To understand how this works, it might help to see an example, but this is very straightforward. Imagine that the first premise was the food has chicken or beef, and the second premise was the food does not have beef. And if those two things are true, we can conclude that the food must have chicken. The reason for this is that the disjunction tells us that at least one of those two things must be true. It must be the case that the food has chicken, or the food has beef, or the food has both. But if we know that the food doesn't have one of those two things, by virtue of the fact that it must have at least one of those two, if it doesn't have one thing, then it must have the other thing. So if it doesn't have beef, it must have chicken. We can prove that this is true logically, both using a truth table and by relying on our old friend modus ponens. Let's start off by using the truth table to prove that this is true. So here we have a truth table with 4 columns. We had 2 simple sentences, P and Q, and then we had our 2 premises to disjunctive syllogism, not P, and P or Q. So if we highlight where our premises are true, starting with P or Q, we see that P or Q is true in the first 3 rows. And if we look at our second premise, we see that not P is true in the bottom 2 rows. Notice that not P and P or Q overlap in their truth values in just the 3rd row. And if we look at the 3rd row where Q is, in the Q column, we see that Q is in fact true, which is exactly what disjunctive syllogism told us. So if not P is true and P or Q is true, it must be the case that Q is true as well. And again, we can prove this by using modus ponens, just how we used modus ponens to prove that modus tollens was true. So we can look at this as a mini proof. So remember that disjunctive syllogism gave us 2 premises, P or Q and not P. And recall back to our replacement rules, we know that we can rewrite disjunctions as implications. So if we do that, if we take line 1 and write that as an implication, using material implication, we get not P implies Q. So we just negate one of those 2, and we get an implication with that. Well, now that we have this implication, you'll notice that line 2 tells us that the antecedent of the implication is true. The implication is not P implies Q, and we actually know that not P is true. And so if we apply modus ponens to that, using lines 2 and 3, we get that the consequent of the implication must be true as well. Q must be true. And that is exactly what we saw with disjunctive syllogism. So that's disjunctive syllogism for you, and I'll see you next time when we talk about more rules of inference. Join me then. Welcome back to Logic 101. I'm William Spaniel, and this lecture is on hypothetical syllogism. Hypothetical syllogism has 2 premises. P implies Q, and Q implies R. So we have 2 implications there. P implies Q, and Q implies R. And if we have those 2 things, we can conclude this 3rd thing, P implies R. So essentially, we're taking the first element and the 3rd element, we're removing the middleman, and we're putting together a new implication that has the first and the 3rd. This is similar in my mind to the transitive property of inequalities in mathematics, where A is greater than B, B is greater than C, and so you can remove B as the middleman and say that just A is greater than C. Similar story here, you can remove the middleman in Q and get a new implication with just the first and the last. This makes sense if you think about it. So here's an example. We could make the first premise, if I am in Buffalo, then I am in New York. We can make the second premise, if I am in New York, then I am in the United States. And therefore, you should be concluding to yourself that if you are in Buffalo, you are also in the United States. And we can verify that this is true using a truth table. So here I've already filled it out. We have 3 simple sentences in the first 3 columns, P, Q, and R, and we have all combinations of truth values for those 3 simple sentences. And I've also constructed the implications of the 2 premises and the conclusion, and we have the truth values there already. So remember that column 4 and column 5 are our premises. If we look at where column 4 is true, well, it's in the top 2 rows and the bottom 4 rows. That is where P is true and Q is true, or P is not true, P is false, and it doesn't matter what Q is in that case.